Welcome back, everybody. Thought I'd start out today with this little cartoon here. Let's take a look. As an invasive species with an endless appetite, they can decimate ecosystems and send species extinct. He's reading the Aquatic Times. And then this fish over here said, Asian carp? And he said, no, humans. So last Thursday, when you did your assignment on looking at those 4 different invasive species, we didn't really talk about the fact that humans are the worst of all in terms of an invasive species. So we'd like to start out the unit by talking about invasive species, because they really give you an appreciation for just how delicate an ecosystem is, a community of organisms that interact with each other and interact with the non-living parts of the environment. And when you get something in there that doesn't belong, it's like a chain reaction of bad things that can happen. So hopefully you have studied those 4 videos that I shared with you, and you did some detailed work on the Google form and have completed that and turned that in. That was a summative assignment, and hopefully you put some work into that. So we're going to continue today with kind of the theme of balance in the ecosystem. I wanted to start out with a picture of a food web here. So you're probably used to, actually, if I can go ahead a little bit, you're probably used to hearing about something called a food chain when you're in elementary school, maybe food webs to some degree, just not quite as detailed as what you're going to do now. A food chain we just kind of see as this row. And the start of a food chain is always something called a producer, which is something that makes its own food using photosynthesis. So that's kind of review from the beginning of the year. And technically, we could actually start all food chains with the sun, because the energy that begins the process is energy that has been captured from the sun. So the next level of the food chain is what we call the primary consumer. So a primary consumer, another name for a primary consumer, is something called an herbivore. You might remember that from elementary school. We don't really use those terms as much as we get older. We talk more in terms of which level they're at in the ecosystem. So this grasshopper is a primary consumer because it only eats plants, algae, things that get their energy from the sun. And then the next level is we could call this a carnivore because it eats meat. But really the term that we use is a secondary consumer. So basically, to identify something as a secondary consumer, it eats a primary consumer. It might also eat producers. So for example, a bear, which is an omnivore, or a raccoon, which is an omnivore, sometimes they can be a primary consumer depending on what they're eating, but sometimes they could be labeled as a secondary consumer. So just because in this food chain, this lizard is labeled as a secondary consumer, that doesn't mean that he never acts as a primary consumer or even a tertiary consumer. So you really have to study each food chain or each part of the food web to really identify what role they're playing at any given time, because that role can change. And in this food chain, the snake is what we call the tertiary consumer. So he is eating secondary consumers. Now that doesn't mean the snake sometimes couldn't also be a secondary consumer. Let's say we take the lizard out of this and the snake comes along and eats the grasshopper. In that case, the snake would be labeled as a secondary consumer. Not really a big deal, but when you get into your activity today, you're going to be studying not just a food chain, but a web of food chains, something that we call a food web. So I'm going to show you, this is a food web of the Everglades, and the reason why I chose this one to show you is that the Burmese python, that first video that I had you guys watch last Thursday, this is the ecosystem that the Burmese python is invading and causing a lot of problems in. Many of you talked about in your Google form, you know, why is it such a big deal to have this problem of having this invasive species? It doesn't really belong in this web. And the problem is that he doesn't have any predators, and he eats pretty much everything in this food web, which leaves all of the other animals with not as much food to eat. So basically what it does is it throws the balance off. And we're going to get more into that on Thursday, how everything kind of needs to be balanced. You might wonder too, well, what eats the alligator, or the top, sometimes it's called the top carnivore, the top predator, the top of the food chain. Not necessarily anything until that organism dies, and then the decomposers like bacteria, fungi, worms, they break that alligator down and put it back into the soil so that those atoms can be used to generate life again, kind of like what we call the circle of life. You may have heard the saying, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So even though that alligator is the top of the food chain, at some point his body will break down and become available again to become part of a new body. So the other thing I wanted to show you in this food web is the direction of the arrows, which is often confusing for kids, because you would think that the arrows point at what eats what, but the arrows actually point at where the energy in the ecosystem is going. It's showing flow of energy. So for example, if we look at this carp in the middle, energy that is stored in that carp's body, in its muscles, its flesh, all of those calories that he produced and now they're being stored, that energy will flow into the alligator. So if the carp gets eaten by the alligator, that energy is now available for the alligator to use, those calories that he's eating. And so some kids might look at this and go, oh, the carp eats the alligator because the carp is pointing at the alligator. But this is actually showing where is the energy going. And it's one of the most confusing things about looking at a food web. When we look at the producers, so the things that get their energy from the sun, we show the energy from the sun flowing into this bladderwort producer, into the butterfly orchid. And then the energy from the butterfly orchid that came from the sun can now go into the mosquito. And the energy from the mosquito could go into the carp, or it could go into the frog. So what you're going to be doing today is studying one of these diagrams and really trying to figure out which ones are the primary consumers, which ones are the secondary, which are the tertiary, kind of following those arrows as you go through. So I have a few friends that are going to get you started, and I'm going to pause and then I will come back.
Hi, I'm a penguin. Do you know where I live? Do you know what I like to eat? Where do I fit in the food chain? I like to eat fish, but only little fish. Am I a producer or a consumer? Am I a carnivore or an herbivore? Do you remember those words?
Hi, my name is Bear. Do you know what things I like to eat? Sometimes I like to eat berries, but other times I like to eat fish. Do you remember what I'm called in the food chain? Am I called a carnivore, an herbivore, or an omnivore? Am I a primary consumer or a secondary consumer?
Hi there, I'm Mr. Wolf. Do you know where I fit in the food chain? Do you think I'm a producer or a consumer? Do you think I'm a primary consumer or am I a quaternary consumer? Where do I fit in the food chain?
Hi, my name is Lou. The garbage truck came the other day and they forgot to pick up Joshua. I like to call him Garbage. I pretty much call everybody Garbage. I like to eat twice a day. Well, I like to eat anything. A lot of times I like to just lick the carpet and try to find a crumb. Sometimes I poop in my pants.
Okay, I hope you had fun with that. So what you're going to be doing today, right now you're watching the intro video. Here's the diagram. All it is a picture that you're going to be using. The questions are right below that, and they're in a Google form, so you'll answer those questions. And then the last thing that I thought would be really fun to do is I made a slideshow called Your Talking Pets. I've been having way too much fun using that app, and I thought it would be cool if you could add a slide of your talking pet or stuffed animal. You can see that you can do it with either one, as you saw me do. This is editable, so you can add a slide on there. Maybe I'll pick the top 3 winners or something like that, something that I thought was really funny, and share those with the group on Thursday. You see I've got mine of Lou that you just saw a few minutes ago, so you could check that out and then add yours right underneath. Just make sure you put your name, your pet or your stuffy's name, and then I'd like you to put something kind of sciencey related to what we're starting to learn about now, which is ecology. So that'll be a fun little challenge for you, a little something extra. I look forward to seeing what you guys have, and I will talk to you on Thursday.